Hello, welcome. I'm Kelly Henderson. I am coordinating this session on Families Partner to Promote Safety for LGBTQ plus youth with disabilities. I'm with Formed Families Forward, a family-led nonprofit organization supporting foster, adoptive, and kinship families, raising children, youth, and young adults with disabilities. Beth Spivak and I are both from Formed Families Forward, and we are pleased and proud to operate a Community Parent Resource Center, CPRC, under the OSEP umbrella. I am really thrilled to be joined by two of our partners, David Aponte with GLSEN Northern Virginia, and you'll learn more about GLSEN in a moment, and Rene Averitt-Sanzone with the Parents Place of Maryland, who is here in her role as a Parent Training and Information Center. Parent Training Information Centers, PTIs, are statewide centers that serve all families with children with disabilities. Let's get started.
As a quick disclaimer, this content represents our views and do not assume it is endorsed by the federal government. The plan for this session is to briefly review data about risk factors, outcomes, and protective factors for LGBTQ plus students with disabilities. We'll provide an overview of LGBTQ plus related terminology, discuss how to make systemic changes to the operation and culture of parent centers, and provide specific examples of the education and collaboration efforts of two parent centers, including hosting family and community trainings, collaborative family and educator initiatives, and partnering with community experts. I'm going to turn it over to David, and he's going to start us off by reviewing the data.
Thanks, Beth. So we see some significant outcomes for LGBTQ plus students with disabilities and LGBTQ plus students in general. GLSEN and several other organizations do research on a regular basis around this. And one of the things that we've seen is that this population is affected by a variety of issues that bring down academic performance, such as chronic absenteeism, which has been linked to low graduation rates and a higher risk of being put in the school to prison pipeline, which is something that we keep a close eye on as well. In addition, LGBTQ plus youth are anywhere from 2 to 3 times more likely to experience homelessness compared to their heterosexual peers. And for a little bit more, we have additional data from GLSEN here. One in particular that I think all of us keep an eye on, which is that a sizable number of LGBTQ students were bullied or harassed at school based on other characteristics. So 36.5% were based on actual or perceived disability. And one of the things that I want to highlight about that statistic is that actual or perceived is the terminology that's used there. We use that word or that phrase quite a bit when it comes to GLSEN research because we recognize that some students in this case might not identify as LGBTQ or might not identify as a student with a disability, but it's what their peers perceive about them and what they're bullied based off of, not necessarily just their identity itself. So in addition, 29.5%, so almost a third of LGBTQ students reported feeling unsafe because of emotional, developmental, or physical disabilities. LGBTQ plus students with disabilities were also at the highest risk for peer victimization, and they had the lowest levels of school connectedness. That connectedness being really important because that often, again, leads to better academic performance, but also leads to better performance in all areas of their lives. So that school connectedness is important as well. Students with disabilities and students identifying as LGBTQ plus report more suicidality than their peers. So beyond just victimization and feeling unsafe, suicidality, so mental health stressors and triggers come into play as well. And finally, a lack of recognition of gender and or sexual identity for LGBTQ plus students with significant physical and or learning disabilities. So this is something that especially today is really important, as we'll get into a little bit later in this presentation when it comes to how we combat this. What are the things that we can do when we talk about positive things, recognizing students of different identities, having policies in place that recognize and affirm who they are is really important. So seeing a statistic like this one and data around this is something that we all want to be mindful of and be careful about as we continue with this work. So with that in mind, before we get into GLSEN's work and what we all can do, I wanted to help provide a little bit of an overview for some key terms related to LGBTQ plus identities. To do this, I'm actually going to kick off with a video, and then we're going to come back to this graphic for a little bit of a review.
Hello, and thanks for joining us today. Before we get started with today's live content, we want to talk about some basic terminology that is important to know when working with people who have diverse sexual orientations or diverse gender identities. There are 4 elements of identity that you will need to know: sex assigned at birth, gender identity, gender expression, and sexual orientation. First is sex assigned at birth, which is based on physical anatomy. This is often assigned before or immediately after birth by looking at the baby's anatomy. The most typical sex assigned at birth is either female or male, but there are other variations of sex worth noting. Variation in sex characteristics can be variations among hormones, chromosomes, or anatomy. The term intersex is used as an umbrella term for those born with varying sex characteristics. About 1 in every 100 people are born intersex. That's more common than most people think. So contrary to popular belief, there are in fact more sexes than just male or female. The next important term to know is gender identity. Gender identity is a person's internal sense of their own gender. All people have a gender identity, though not many people think about it. Gender identity is how you feel about your gender and your role in your culture's gendered practices. Gendered practices vary from culture to culture, so there isn't only one way to define being a girl, woman, boy, man, or any other gender. Gender identity forms very early in childhood, with some science pointing to as early as 2 years old. When young children start to say, "I'm a boy" or "I am a girl," they are describing how they feel about their own gender. I would like to explain a few key terms related to gender identity. The word cisgender describes a person whose gender identity and sex assigned at birth match. The word transgender describes a person whose gender identity differs from their sex assigned at birth. The term transgender is also an umbrella term for gender identities like gender fluid, non-binary, and agender. For more information on these terms, click the glossary link in the description. The next term you will want to know is gender expression. Gender expression describes how people express their gender externally. This could be through clothing, hobbies, mannerisms, or hairstyles. Gender expression and the expectations around expression have changed over time, and they may change day to day depending on how a person feels. Sometimes, one might dress more masculine one day and then decide to dress more feminine the next day. It's important to note that gender expression does not tell us how someone identifies their gender, and it is best not to assume who someone is based on their style of clothing. It's best to ask the person how they identify. Lastly, we will talk about sexual orientation. Sexual orientation describes feelings of attraction. Think back to when you had your last crush. What were the feelings you had? Maybe you felt excited when you saw the person you liked. Maybe you got nervous or shy around them. Or maybe your heart raced and you had attraction. Think back to when you had your last crush. What were the feelings you had? Maybe butterflies. These are all feelings of attraction. Attraction can mean different things to different people, but one thing to note is that these feelings are not a choice or something someone can control. We cannot tell our heart to slow down or our butterflies to go away. Sexual orientation can start to form around early childhood. Think back to when you had your very first crush. This is when your sexual orientation started to develop. Common terms you hear associated with sexual orientation are lesbian, gay, bisexual, pansexual, queer, and straight. Lesbian describes a girl or woman who is primarily attracted to other girls or women. Gay describes boys or men who are primarily attracted to other boys or men. But this term is also used by anyone who is attracted to the same gender. Bisexual refers to people who are attracted to their own gender as well as other genders. Pansexual refers to someone who is attracted to people regardless of gender. Asexual is used to describe someone who may not feel sexual attraction to any gender. This does not mean that the person doesn't want to be in relationships. It just means that the element of sexual attraction is absent. You might have also heard the term queer. Queer is used as an umbrella term that can only be defined by the individual using it. The term continues to be hurtful to some people, especially older populations who experience this term as a slur. However, some people use this term as a source of pride and a symbol of determination. It's always best to use the term only if the person self-identifies as queer, and if the person gives you permission to refer to them in that way. Lastly, some people identify as straight, which means they are attracted to people of the opposite gender. Now that you have some basic terminology under your belt, you're ready to jump into more specific content to get to know this population's experiences better, and to gain skills on how to serve them best.
One of the things that I wanted to highlight in that video is that a lot of it was about identity. So if we could just go to the previous slide for a moment here. There are terms that a lot of people use to identify themselves. And you see that gender identity, for example, is how you identify, how you see yourself. So when you hear terms like queer or the various terms that were expressed there, it's really important to recognize how someone identifies themselves and not make assumptions. So when we see something like gender expression, which we see at the bottom right of this graphic, that's how someone wants to display their gender. We often, because it's human nature, use gender expression to then assume gender identity. It can be really difficult, but a huge part of this work is not making assumptions about those with different identities or about people in general, right? We all know our life lessons around assumptions and what that does to us. But really, we want to make sure that we're allowing a person to identify themselves and asking questions if we need to. In that video, it says it's best to ask someone how they identify. And that's really something that we try to live by with all of the work that we do, because we just don't know. So I like this graphic just to put a little bit of a bow on that video, because I think it represents what we see well. When we talk about gender identity, so we've removed sexual orientation from this conversation at least, but when we talk about gender identity, we really see that there's a triangle that forms it. So it's that gender attribution, which is how your gender is perceived by others. So what others think that you are, what your gender expression is, so how you choose to display your gender, and then your sex assigned at birth, which is what the medical community labels you. And that triangle forms around gender identity itself, which again is how you identify. So all of these elements work together to add up to your gender identity. And I think the video does a nice job of pointing out well that this is something that's fluid, right? Someone could choose to wear different clothes on a different day, and that may just be changing their gender expression. It may be a bigger expression of their gender identity itself. So it's always best, again, not to assume and to ask questions. So there's some basic terminology to learn. Now, I want to talk a little bit about what GLSEN does as well. First off, GLSEN's mission is to ensure that LGBTQ students are able to learn and grow in a school environment free from bullying and harassment. Now, GLSEN for a long time has focused on K-12 education. We also have programs that touch learning at other levels. And of course, because all students are involved in education in these grades, this also naturally comes home with them. And their LGBTQ identity is certainly a part of who they are. But primarily, our work is focused on the education space. So you see here that our advocacy with school boards across the country is really active, and we're encouraging school boards to adopt enumerated and up-to-date policies and regulations for all areas that impact their students. So this usually means non-discrimination policies, dress code and those sorts of things to make sure that they're consistent with representing their students. One of the really important things that we do as well is the biannual National School Climate Survey. And we also make a local school climate survey available on our website in case you want to see more localized data. And when we say local, that could be one school, it could be a school district, it could be a county. There are a variety of ways to do it. But research is incredibly important. Before the video, I showed you some research, some data that's come from GLSEN. We've been running that survey for decades now of LGBTQ students. It's the largest of its kind in the world that focuses on LGBTQ students in particular. And we see it as really important to the work that we do. Now, when it comes to more specific versions of that work, we focus on what we identify as 4 school supports. So the first is developing supportive educators. Honestly, supportive educators save lives. And we've seen from our research that just one visibly supportive educator in a school can help LGBTQ students feel safer and more seen. They can also advocate on LGBTQ students' behalf to school administration and can directly implement LGBTQ inclusive content in their curriculum. Finally, they serve in a role of addressing the bullying that we talked about previously, and they can serve as advisors to students to formally organize supportive groups at the school, which I'll get to in just a moment. And really, for many students, having adult allies in their school to whom they can turn to for support, or even simply knowing that they exist, creates a more welcoming and safe environment for them. The second support that we have identified is to help pass and implement comprehensive policies. So this goes a little bit with the work that I was talking about before with school boards. In addition to advocating for these sorts of policies at the school board level, we also do the same with local, state, and the federal government. So we want to make sure that we're always pushing for policies, again, that adequately represent and work for LGBTQ+ students. The third support that we have is advocating for inclusive and affirming curriculum. This is a special focus area of ours at the moment, with curriculum changing so much across the country. So we are working with a lot of school districts to not only have them adopt these comprehensive policies, but also then further implement those policies by giving them model curriculum directly. So when we talk about inclusive curriculum, it's not all special different topics that we need to teach. It's how do we positively talk about LGBTQ+ people in our science curriculum, in the math curriculum, in the various history curricula that we see across grade levels and across classes. So it's making sure that all the curricula that's out there is affirming and inclusive for LGBTQ+ people and students. And finally, our last focus is on supporting student GSAs. GSAs are called a variety of things across the country. It generally stands for Gender and Sexuality Alliance. Some of you might have also heard about gay straight alliances. We've kind of moved away from that term a little bit. But long story short, these are LGBTQ+ student-led clubs across the country that organize in a variety of ways. Sometimes they meet up across schools and have events. Other times they're just social or supportive clubs within their school. But mostly our job is to support all of these clubs in bringing about change in whatever way they would like to bring about change. So whether that's helping them organize an event, helping them get a policy passed at their school, or just giving them some guidance for their meetings, we see it as really important to support these student clubs. It also encourages students to be more active in their local communities, and often expands to their local communities and makes it a more safe and affirming place for everyone. So that's a little bit about the work that GLSEN does. And with that, we'll talk a little bit about parent centers.
Oh, thank you, David. Very informative and very helpful. So what we want to talk about now or share now is about the potential role and the impact that we as parent centers can have in supporting the community, the youth, the families. So some of the things we can do here is that we definitely, we're all about data and being and able to provide that data-based research to really show and support that there are really negative outcomes in non-affirming schools by the calls that we receive from our families. We also show that, what happens when there are affirming schools and that they definitely have improved outcomes. Really making sure that we also can bring caregivers and the community and educators together for learning opportunities and collaborations, because There's a lot of terminology, and for a lot of folks, this is really new information, so we can help with that. We also can help provide those safe spaces for learning and asking questions. Like David said, you know, when there is a one affirming teachers that, you know, it really does save lives, and we can also play that role as parent centers. And that also, and here's one example today with this session, as far as partnering with LGBTQ plus advocacy groups to help broaden the knowledge and understanding. You know, while parent centers are definitely the experts in supporting families and children and youth with disabilities, we are not the expert in everything. So it is really important to collaborate and partner with the folks that really, this is their area of expertise, so we can also learn and grow. So, so I've talked about parent centers in general. So I'd really like to talk just one example. We're sharing two examples here today of parent centers. So from the Parents Place of Maryland, as Kelly had shared, we are the Parent Training Information Center for the state of Maryland. So we serve all of our families statewide. But here are some things that we've done within our organization to really help be more inclusive of the LGBTQ plus community and families. So one of the things that we did is that about 2 or 3 years ago, we had to revise our strategic plan. And one of the pieces that we really looked at was our mission statement. And while mission statements are very similar as far as empowering families to be their child's advocate, is very important, we really questioned ourselves to say, are we really meeting all with this mission statement? And so for us, we added a piece in our mission statement about making a commitment to equity and diversity so that we could be even more proactive and more forward facing with that. One of the, within that, then we started to also restructure the organization and staffing positions. So we actually created an equity and engagement coordinator position, just so that we were really walking the walk that we were talking, which I think is really important for all of us to do as organizations. The other piece that we wanted to be really mindful of, and we know this as parent centers, and I think it's also supported in the data that David has shared with us, is with our websites and with our materials, we really develop them such that, does everybody see themselves, right? Do they know that this is an organization that if I have an LGBTQ plus child or young adult, is this an organization that I can call that is safe, that can answer my questions, isn't going to judge me, isn't going to make me feel less than, and we're welcoming and we're affirming. So we really want to make sure that everything that we are doing, that families feel seen in that. One of the other pieces that we did, and you'll notice it in all of our introductions, we've added our pronouns. So we also, and this was part of our internal professional development, we really did a lot of extensive training and continue to do training, because it is always something that we need to be constantly reinforcing within ourselves, is that, you know, we've done lots of training, lots of equity training, but also very targeted training in LGBTQ plus, and adding our pronouns, and not only just adding our pronouns in English, but adding our pronouns in Spanish, so that, again, we're being really inclusive of that welcoming and those affirming pieces with that. The other pieces are social media, really wanting to make sure that we're promoting content. So at parent centers, we are what we call a no judgment zone. So we want to make sure that the material that we're sharing is evidence-based, researched, informed, or it's based on policies, so that we are really elevating the content that is very reliable content for families, like GLSEN's resources. As you can tell, I love GLSEN's work. So I'm a little bit biased with that. And so we've talked about the internal professional development, but the other piece that we're doing at the Parents Place of Maryland is being that external partner around professional development. And really, when we're doing work with professionals around family engagement, right, that we are really also looking at that as another opportunity that, all right, does all mean all when we're talking about family engagement, so that we're really making sure that we are being very inclusive and helping to support our partners in this work too, and connecting them with the great resources that are available to all of us. So just a little bit about what's going on to Parents Place of Maryland. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Beth.
Thanks, Renee. It was actually interesting for me to hear more detailed information about your journey. So I wanted to talk about our journey at Form Families Forward, and how we came to see working with the LGBTQ plus community as being really central to our mission. So Form Families Forward is a nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting foster, kinship, and adoptive families of children and youth with disabilities and other special needs. So we serve the families and educators and child welfare professionals that we work with in the Northern Virginia area. And we became involved with this population because LGBTQ plus youth are disproportionately impacted by their gender identity. So LGBTQ youth are overrepresented in the foster care system, and foster care placements and adoptions are disrupted at an alarming rate because some caregivers and parents do not accept the youth's gender identity. Our goal is to improve outcomes by providing a safe space to discuss concerns and normalize the experience that these families are going through, and the children as well. Even accepting caregivers do not know how to support their children, especially in the school setting. Teachers and school staff often want to be supportive, but don't know how. We've been working on projects that support collaboration, understanding, and respect. The first project we did was to partner with Fairfax County Domestic and Sexual Violence Services to present the Safe Zone training. Safe Zone is a national training program which provides allies with tools to create change and make spaces safer for all LGBTQ plus students. This 2-session training was open enrollment and attracted a wide and diverse audience. I think it was our biggest audience of the year, actually, in that year. And some participants of this Safe Zone training also participated in our next effort, a partnership with a colleague from the department, the Virginia Department of Education, Training, and Technical Assistance Center, or TTAC, and David, which is how we met David, for a book study. We used a book called The Educator's Guide to LGBTQ plus Inclusion to facilitate collaborations between parents, caregivers, educators, and other professionals. And I think that was really successful as well. And it was super helpful to have a parent center staff and David available to answer questions that we certainly would not have been able to answer on our own. And Form Families Forward staff is encouraged to attend trainings on LGBT plus Q issues. And we also share our pronouns all the time to show clients that we are an affirming parent center. And we also work really hard to address content relevant to LGBTQ, to the community in all our trainings. And so everyone is welcome. And now Kelly is going to post some scenarios that center around LGBTQ issues and best practices.
Thanks, Beth. And I think David's going to help me out here with some perspective that he can share from his work at GLSEN. So we know that working with parent centers or community parent resource centers, that sometimes situations and scenarios come up and we're not always sure what to do. And so we thought we'd share a couple perhaps more common or more likely scenarios. Perhaps these are familiar to you. And maybe you have all the answers and you don't need this, but we thought we'd get our resident expert, David's perspective on these. So I'm just going to share 3 quick scenarios that may be common, and David's going to give us a little insight, and then we're going to wrap up. So the first scenario is parent center staff are conducting a training or an event with a youth. The youth discloses that they are gay or lesbian. to the youth participants in the event, as well as the facilitator, who's a Parent Center staff member, but makes a point to come to the Parent Center staff facilitator at break and shares that they have not told their parents about their identity and asks the facilitator not to tell their parents. So that's our first scenario, with youth sharing sensitive information and indicating that they have not shared that information with their parent or caregiver. Scenario 2, a parent contacts a community parent resource center about a youth with special needs who wants to use the bathroom at their school that matches their gender identity. But the school is not willing to do that. The parent, the caller, wants to know what rights that they have to assist their student in using the bathroom of their choice. And finally, something sort of internal to center practices, a PTI plans a training that includes content examples of students with disabilities who are also LGBTQ+. A board member of the PTI organization sends a strongly worded objection to the board and to all staff members, saying that the organization has no business endorsing LGBTQ life choices. So David, tell us how we might consider our challenges in these scenarios.
Yeah, thanks for posing those scenarios. And I think the ones that you came up with are indicative of things that we see obviously within the community that we're talking about, but also outside of it. So I really like the bullet point that's on the slide here that talks about looking at all interactions through a lens that is mindful of the LGBTQ plus community. To put that in a little bit of context and relate it to these scenarios, when you look at something through a different lens, oftentimes it means leading from behind, right? It means asking questions, finding out what the people involved would like you to do. So I think about the first example a little bit, where a student is sharing sensitive information. They've made it clear that they don't want that information shared yet with some people in their lives. And sometimes that, following their lead means not sharing that information with other people, respecting their wishes there. Now, while the other two are a little bit different here. So on a school policy level, that's where you can contact your friendly local neighborhood GLSEN chapter and get them involved if you'd like to. And we'd be happy to help. This is something that we're working on around bathrooms. But again, you want to find out what the student in the community is looking for, what work has already been done, right? Ask some questions to see what would work best. And then finally, around center practices and some of those conversations that might result from a presentation like that one. This is information that's new to a lot of people, as has been mentioned a couple times. So sometimes more clarification of the information is needed, but also an understanding of even where the person's coming from, why they're frustrated with the information, and then just an explanation on your end of what it is that you're trying to accomplish, right? What it is that you'd like to do with this information. And again, we always have a bunch of resources to share with people who want different ways to explain things. A lot of people tend to come around when they feel like they're part of the decision making or that input process, right, for a lot of these issues. So again, looking at it through a different lens, asking yourself first, how is this helping the community that we're serving? And in this case, the LGBTQ plus community, I think, is what I would always advise to keep in mind.
Thank you, David. Good guidance. We so appreciate your participation in this event and hope that you took away some good information. I know that Beth, David, and Rene are all very willing to be contacted and provide additional thoughts, guidance, create a community, perhaps of parent centers that are doing this kind of work and dedicated to advancing inclusivity. So we were here for you, and we again thank you for participating. Rene, Beth, David, anything finally you'd like to share? All right.
Thanks everybody for watching.
Yeah, thanks for watching.
Yes, absolutely.
All right. Thanks so much and take care.